Okay, so having covered all of the pre-election election process, we're now going to move into the general election. So one of the things that you saw from that standardized kind of, essay question was, what shifts? So again, what I've got is different electorate. Who shows up for the primaries?
The fanatics.
The fanatics, those diehards, right? We've got kind of lower numbers of people that feel who have a bigger impact because of the lower numbers and because of their kind of intensity. So I've got different kind of electorate, and that involves typically a kind of a pivot. Where did we say you go during the primaries to kind of win support? Where in the political spectrum?
Left and right.
Left and the right. Where do you typically come to win during the general election? The middle. Because again, if you're the Democratic candidate, you can be reasonably assured that most Democrats are going to kind of support you. It's rare that they'll kind of flip, right? So who are you going for? Who are you trying to convince? Not necessarily Democrats, but who? What's the term?
Moderates.
Those independents, those moderates, those people that are maybe unaffiliated. Now, the secret is most people like to say often that they're independent, but they lean, right? So there are those that maybe really are kind of somewhere middle of the spectrum that you're trying to get, or you're trying to get the people that lean, but wouldn't take that much persuading to get to your side. In addition, your opponents are different. This again allows you to adopt some different strategies. Again, I might, in the primaries, often what you've got is a whole field of people that are trying to go to the polls, to the left and the right, and you're trying to distinguish yourself from them. I'm more conservative, I'm more liberal, or maybe there's some other appealing factors. Sometimes what you're trying to do in the primaries too is just establish your electability, that there's 14 of us and I'm the best one in this field to beat the other side. So sometimes what you do in the primaries is you remind your opponents, or excuse me, your supporters that yes, this is a primary, but keep the general election in mind. That's kind of an important thing later on. Another major distinction is the amount of focus and spotlight it gets. Not a lot of focus. There is focus and spotlight during the primaries, but certainly nothing compared to the general elections. Here's another kind of way of kind of showing you that primaries and general elections are different. What's our turnout for presidential elections?
50%.
Around 50%. What's it for congressional?
35.
35 to 40. Sometimes it goes a little higher. What's that telling you? This is for presidential primaries. I haven't found a congressional one yet.
5%.
Yeah, it's less than those numbers, right? It's even less. That we're somewhere in the 20s. We've dipped down to like the teens. And in 2008, there was a big spike, and you can kind of see another big spike here in 2016. But we're still well below congressional numbers, let alone presidential
There
numbers.
seems to be a lot of voter apathy among the Republicans. They don't seem to be voting in.
So, and that's it. Good. So if you're looking at if you're looking at this with the AP lens, what's the trend? What's the yellow line represent? The total, right? So then I can look at the blue lines and the red lines and see if there's kind of differences, in those. Is there more apathy amongst Republicans versus the Democrats?
Right.
What's been happening to the blue line over time? So good. All right. Now, having established we're about to kind of take on a different beast where you've got a different amount of focus, a different kind of opponent, and therefore maybe different strategies about how you're positioning yourself ideologically, let's just get into the nuts and bolts of the Electoral College. And this is more review, right? So why do we have the Electoral College historically? How do we feel about democracy, Paul?
We don't like the mob.
We don't like the mob, right? We don't trust the average voter to kind of make this kind of decision directly, right? So in its historic purpose, what are you actually voting for when you go to vote for president? Colby.
You're basically voting for the guy who's going to cast the actual vote. For the
Good.
president.
So how do we say that? Each state has a what?
Slate of electors.
A slate of electors based on,
How many members you have in the
yeah, based on their kind of congressional representation, right? So you're not smart enough to vote for president. You're smart enough to vote for the guy that's gonna, or the woman that's gonna vote for president, right? When you vote in a state, you vote for a person within a slate of electors, okay? So that's essentially its historic design and purpose. What changed the historic kind of intent? What did the framers not necessarily anticipate? Washington was hoping would stay away from them. Political parties, right? So you guys know that. If you were, again, having an essay where you had to kind of tackle the Electoral College and you had to do some kind of definitional work, you know, you would start with the intent and kind of the historic form. The idea that, again, you're electing a slate of electors who are supposed to be informed, rational, and independent. And they're gonna make their decision based on their best kind of judgment. Along come political parties, and it nullifies that intent. Now what I mean by that is, again, that slate of electors, state by state, it's a little different in terms of their mechanisms, but the party picks the slate. And the party is typically gonna pick die-hard kind of political supporters who are almost like a rubber stamp. You know, so again, if your state goes Democratic, the Democratic slate gets to kind of cast their vote, and they're invariably gonna go vote Democratic. Occasionally, there's been 7 occasions of faithless electors. That's a pretty damning term, don't you think? Faithless. And essentially what they're doing is they're casting their vote differently than they were bound. So is that a possibility? Could you have you know, mass defection by these electors and they kind of cast their vote differently than they're bound? Sure. Has it ever happened in any kind of with any kind of numeric significance? No. All right. So that's not something to have kind of a long-term concern about.
What happens if you're a faithless elector and you're caught? What happens to you?
Well, it's pretty public because you've cast your vote differently. So again, you saw this with the most recent election where you know, within the Republican Party, Trump was an anti-establishment candidate, and the electors were picked by the party, and so you had a lot of establishment-type people forced to kind of cast a vote for Trump where they found that the antithesis of what they wanted to do, and so some broke ranks. They face civil penalties typically.
It's not like a federal crime.
No, so you know, you might have the state will kind of come up with the rules, because again, think about it, the political parties have a say, the states have a say, the federal government has a say.
Right.
This is where the states would kind of set up their rules that bind, along with the party, that bind those electors.
Gotcha.
And so sometimes it might be a little more substantial financially, sometimes it's less so. And then there's the whole question of, would you be prosecuted for it? You know, it's there, is it enforced?
So since you, like, obviously from last season election, somebody did get punished for it, but if there was like enough people like where it significantly mattered if they did it,
Yeah.
would the vote, obviously, does the vote still count if you do it?
So again, that's one of those scenarios where until we set a precedent, we don't necessarily have a binding rule. And you could make arguments, maybe in a legal argument in one direction or the other.
Right.
There's nothing that necessarily, that I can see that would preclude it entirely. You would potentially, it'd be a hot mess, to be honest with you, because it'd almost be like a state by state kind of case to look at how legally bound was that person. And then eventually, you kind of sort it out maybe on the national level with the Supreme Court case, or with the Supreme Court kind of speed us along with that. Really, again, it's another way of kind of telling you that our system is once again based more on norms and traditions than sometimes these clear-cut rules. And that's what allows you guys to come up with these scenarios. Now, speaking of norms and kind of the unexpected, along comes the election of 1796 and 1800. You remember those? That's where we kind of realized that political parties have thrown us a monkey wrench. What's the problem in 1796? Who's running? How does the election
Adams and
go?
Jefferson
So
tied.
I got Jefferson and I've got Adams, and it results in a tie. Explain that to me.
No, it's not a tie.
Well, excuse me, not a tie.
They,
They're
Jefferson
two
is
different
Adams'
parties, but
vice
the two
president,
highest
even
vote
though they're
getters.
from two different parties because the,
So the candidates, let's reframe what you guys said. The candidates are running as
Federalists.
kind of members of a party. How are the electors voting?
Wait a second, like,
all of them.
They're not voting necessarily along party lines. So what ends up happening is top vote getter gets president, second top vote getter gets vice president. We have put together, in a rather unhappy political marriage, two political opposites. Okay, so Adams is president, Jefferson is vice president. I put a Federalist with a Democratic Republican. So what's the clever strategy they decide to kind of adopt in the election of 1800? What does Jefferson and Adams do?
Run as tickets.
So they run on a ticket, right? So they're gonna have running mates. What does the ballot fail to specify?
It doesn't do that.
Who's intended to be president and vice president? Because of zealous kind of party voting this time by the electorate, what do we have?
A
A
tie.
tie, that's my tie, right? And, you know, we obviously go into the famous tensions that surround there. Because it's a tie, where do we go?
House.
The House, right? To settle, decide who? President. How do we decide the vice president? What I'm indicating is, and you've got to dip into kind of you got to go way back to when you read the Constitution, there's a different mechanism to select the vice president, a different body, Senate, right?
He's president of the Senate, if that makes sense.
Well, yeah, in part, that's part of the logic, but again, it's also that, you know, idea of checks and balances, separation of
The
powers.
president would then pick it. So like Jefferson could then say Burr, and they would have to confirm it, or?
Well, you think of it this way, the House is the most democratic of bodies, it gives more representation to what kind of states?
All states. No, large states.
Large states, right? So is this a kind of check on large states and the kind of the popular whims by having the Senate kind of weigh in on the vice president? That's part of the idea of the balance. And then you do have, like, you'd suggest, like, the vice president would be more unique to the Senate. At any rate, you do have that kind of drama where it gets thrown in the House. You have like 36 different kind of ballots, all these insults, all these great memes that kind of follow as a result. Okay.
Wow.
Too soon.
Wow.
So that's all kind of fun backdrop. But what it is indicating is that there is obviously political parties throw a monkey wrench in things, and we need a fix. And it actually was up there. What amendment fixes it that establishes separate ballots and the provisions for when we have electoral ties? 12th Amendment, right? So having kind of looked at all of that, you could still be kind of in your definitional work where you're looking at numbers, right? Because the numbers are really important. If congressional representation is based on, if the number of electors is based on congressional representation, what is the total number of electors up for grabs? There's a little tricky math, right? How many in the Senate? 100. How many in the House? 435. They're mumbling it. So total of 538. So how does 100 plus 435 equal 538?
Plus 30.
3 for DC, right? And you know all the backdrop to that we wanted to keep them politically neutral, but that's probably an impossibility, and it denies them representation in the presidential election. So let's give them delegates so that they have some sort of congressional representation, and let's give them delegates in the Electoral College. Long story short, 538 means the magic number to win is 270. That's part of the math. How do 48 of the 50 states award their delegates?
Winner take all.
Winner take all, right? So again, as you were, describing things, these are the kind of the numerics that you might hit, right? Maine, Nebraska, if there's 48 of the 50 doing winner take all, what are the other two doing? And they do a proportional system. So the proportion of the vote you get describes the proportion of the electors you get, where the numbers are pretty low either way, 4 and 5, right? So that's the math that we have there, okay? What it means is, this is a race to 270, where if I look at the map, each state has a certain amount of electors based on their population and the fact that they're a state. They have a certain number based on congressional representation. So, California with 55, Massachusetts with 11, we got 38, we got 29. How do I get them? Well, I'm gonna flip them based on whether or not you got the majority of the vote.
So, for the proportional ones, Maine and Nebraska, right?
Yep.
is that like, how do like candidates usually approach going about those states? Do they ignore them because it's like a minuscule amount, or is it ever like a key point because of
So that's it. I mean, I think that's a good question in that it is a numbers game, and you have a strategy. You have a pathway. Like a lot of these electoral maps are these kind of great things where they kind of show a pathway to 270, and okay, I know as a Democrat I've got Massachusetts. I know as a Republican I've got a lot of these southern states. Where am I viable? Where do I need to, like, what numbers do I need to pick up, and where am I most likely to pick them up? Because you've got limited time, limited resources, so would a proportional state, kind of like Maine, come into play? Sure, if the numbers supported it. And that's literally why those strategists are so important. Okay, so what I want to do again is I'm going to create my kind of, my pathway by kind of thinking about which states I can flip. Win a majority in 58 of these, 48 of these 50 states, I flip the state, right? I get their electors. Win with a plurality, and I'm going to flip it, right? Even if I won with 33% of the vote in Texas, because let's say there was 4 candidates.
You still win the whole.
I still win the whole shooting match, right? So again, we flip the state. Now again, what I tried to indicate in the past is that this gives somewhat of a false perception of political identity. Because as I drill down and I take a look at, say, a blue state, it might all of a sudden look more red than blue, right? So what explains why Florida, in this case, went Democrat when it looks like it's Republican? Colin.
The heavily populated
Yeah, again, Democrats tend to do better in kind of urban areas, heavily populated areas. The population there outnumbers the population here, and consequently, it looks like a red state is actually a blue state. So that's one of the ways it's deceiving. The other thing too is the degree of color. The brighter the red, the heavier they went Republican. The brighter the blue, the heavier they went Democratic. So you can often see that as you drill down, we're a little closer and a little more competitive than we think. There's not a lot of votes there separating Obama and Romney.
I was actually looking at this today because I was talking to one of my friends about, like, if Vegas went like Democratic or Republican.
Right.
And I looked at the state, like I brought up like this map for the last election.
Right.
And in Nevada, although it went blue, you would look at it and only 2 counties voted Democrat. The one
Right.
that Vegas is in and the one that Reno is in.
Yeah.
And then the whole state is just like pretty much solid red.
And then if you think about Vegas, it's pretty much, it is just Vegas and Reno, right?
Because Nevada is empty desert, and then
Yep.
you cross over hill and there's Vegas.
Yep.
Like, is this real?
But there are these rural kind of in other kind of pockets. So this gets back to Charlie's question too. Not only am I thinking about Maine, I'm thinking about this county that's slightly red. And we've got all kinds of Democrats. There have been people that have canvassed the neighborhood, that have knocked on doors and talked to people, and they've got a kind of a list. They've got a list of people that have donated. They've got a list of people that have signed petitions in the past, or maybe supported certain interest groups. And we're going to target. It's called having a ground game. You've got this kind of technological knowledge. Then the strategists kind of create this ground game, and we go start knocking on doors. That's how intense the strategy is.
This might be a question that complicates things a little
Yeah.
bit. But how does voting like this, or voting in any election, work on a native reservation?
Interesting. So, they are considered kind of a sovereign nation
Sort of.
within United States.
Right.
And there is a question of citizenship that
Well, it's due
allows them to, I mean, obviously they're going to vote in congressional and presidential elections, but then they have their own kind of local, maybe tribal kind of representation.
Because there's like tribal knowledge, but like in Connecticut, I'm pretty sure gambling is illegal, but Mohican Sun is open.
Right. So, in terms of, whether or not people would go in there and canvass, sure. That's certainly a demographic that they would have information and interest in. In terms of like how they set up polling places in elections, I don't have all of the specifics, but I would imagine there's just basically kind of parallel and then separate,
Right.
kind of procedures.
See, that's kind of funny because, well, So the U.S. government obviously affects them, and so they should be able to vote.
Right.
Because obviously they're affected, but the territories of the U.S., like,
Yep. So, I mean, here's what makes it interesting in that, and this is the only reason it popped into my head. There was just kind of a legal theory floated out there as to whether the Dreamers could seek asylum within native kind of reservations and lands, because they're sovereign. And, you know, interesting, but again, yeah, you guys do like throwing those hypotheticals at me, especially when the recorder is running. So again, keep in mind that, you know, the first map that we looked at, the red and blue map, kind of obscures things. And I used to be able to preach it, and I used to say it with a straight face that we're not a red state, we're not a red country, we're not a blue country, we're purple. But I don't know. Again, what I've maintained is that one of the factors is it's kind of called self-sorting, which is compounded by kind of districting and gerrymandering. We have settled into like-minded communities because it's part of our, it's like identity for us. You know, I want to be surrounded by like-minded people because it makes me feel better about what I think. And that gets reinforced when I draw a district around it, and I kind of like, you know, compound that. It gets compounded by when I only listen to certain news sources, and my social media feeds reinforce what I'm thinking. And so and then we stop agreeing on facts. We start kind of like, you know, if a news story does not suit my likes and dislikes, I'm going to discount it, right? So we become, you know, the hyper-partisan Congress is really just a reflection of our own hyper-partisanness. And so I don't know if I can say this anymore with a straight face. But I would hope that we'd come back to it a little bit, because, I mean, fundamentally, there's got to be more that we agree on than disagree. We just ideally disagree on the pathway to things. I would think that we all believe in rule of law, and separation of powers, and checks and balances, and on it goes with the cornerstones. And I would think that we all want a growing economy, and you know, maybe we have different ideas about immigration, but there's a recognition that we're a nation of immigrants, and that is one of our strong points. So how do we continue to value immigration, but do it in a way that, I don't know, protects economies and growth and things like that? On and on I can go.
I think, yeah, like one person put it best, like government shouldn't be a sport where there has to be one clue to find winner. It should be a place where people can come together and create a system where we create rules, and we don't agree with all of the rules.
Right. So I think that red hat, blue hat mentality is really a good image, where just like we have a blind allegiance to sports teams, and we won't, like, listen, don't call them Belichick. There was never any Deflategate. You can't tell me anything wrong that ever happened with the Patriots. I'm going to do the Tom Brady diet. You know, that's, as farcical as that seems, that kind of that overzealousness and that kind of blind allegiance and thought process, it seems to have pervaded politics a little bit, okay? So, at any rate, I'm on a somewhat of a tangent, but probably one of the more important reasons why you take the class. They're just not gonna quiz you on that in the test. Let's start looking at some of the criticisms here in a second. Yep, so people often, again, are upset with this system, but again, I think they get flipped as to what they're upset about, right? Basically, again, the shorthand is, what do people say when they talk about the electoral system, about their vote?
Don't count.
It doesn't count, right? Because your vote isn't directly cast for the candidate, right? Okay, let's think about that a little more critically. What happens is there is a, how do I want to kind of phrase this? Your vote is, does the elector invariably cast the way that they're directed? Yeah, okay. So it's indirect in a sense. The problem isn't that your vote doesn't count, it just is indirect. It gets diffused, it seems, right? So that's not really what we're mad at. It's essentially what happens is your vote gets put through kind of this funhouse mirror, and the numerics are kind of like changed. So instead of being one vote out of, you know, a nation of 320 million, you're, you know, voting for a slate of electors. And it gets, like I said, maybe a little distorted, okay? So, you know, this is, in part what people are mad at, about how their vote is distorted. We get mad too at kind of how we campaign because of the chasing of these numerics, right? So what kind of states do candidates go to if you're trying to win 270?
Swing states.
Yeah, swing states. So those are my swing states. What other kind of state would I go to? I want 270.
So hang on, you've got swing states and states that you know you're gonna win?
Well, I may not spend a lot of my limited time and resources in the state that I've got in lockdown. I keep stressing the number, 270.
Oh, states with a lot of, you're not gonna
Yeah.
spend a lot of time in like Wyoming, which is just a man among cows.
So
like
let's
California.
kind of combine the two, right? I want to go to large, states, assuming that they're competitive, and competitive is relative. I might, historically never, a party may not have historically won a particular state, but maybe you've got a chance. And if I go there, the other candidate's got to go there, and they're draining themselves of time and resources. So there's things that kind of make large states that have historic patterns still competitive. And then I want to go to those swing states, right? Well, how do the rest of us feel? Okay, so there's a kind of a criticism that certain states, and therefore if it's certain states, their issues, and if it's their issues, it's also their demographics, get a disproportionate amount of time and kind of money, right? Similarly, you said you're not going to go to the Dakotas or Montana. Well, you won't, but then some people complain that a state like Montana, which has 3 electoral votes, has more electoral votes than it deserves based on you're guaranteed at least one representative, regardless of your population. So they're going to say that big states are overrepresented, and on some level small states are overrepresented. And then you put your vote through that like funhouse mirror. So in this scenario, if you won 54% of the popular vote in Ohio, you get all 21 electoral votes. But if we did that as a proportion, you would get essentially 11 votes out of 10. So do it as a winner take all, I've got a 21-0 advantage. Do it as a proportional system, I get a 1 vote advantage. Okay? So people are mad how it skews it. It skews it to the point where if I win, there's 7 really big states, and if you combine them with a handful of other states, I can win the election. I can win the election with a combination of 11 states out of the 50. That's pretty wild. It also makes possible, again, winning the popular vote, but losing the election, or vice versa. All you have to do there is win certain competitive states by a razor's margin in 11 kind of places, and then lose the rest in a landslide. And that's not one of your fictional kind of things you're coming up with. It's happened 5 times, including most recently. In fact, it's happened with alarming frequency in the 2000s, right? You've got Bush and Gore, and you've got Hillary and Trump. And not only is it, there's 2 different stories, I guess, in the election of 2000 versus 2016. What is this telling you? How close was it?
One state.
One state.
By like hundreds of votes.
You got to do kind of the quick math. Yeah, that's the real. When you see that it came down to roughly how many?
500.
Like 500 votes. And people are saying my vote doesn't matter, but holy cow, that made a difference there, didn't it?
Georgetown cast its vote.
So, what is this one telling you? Because there, it's a matter of someone winning the electoral college by carrying Florida and therefore winning the electoral vote, but it was a difference of 500. And when you look at it nationally, that number gets skewed. But what do you see here?
It's about 2%, which is 62 to 65, about 3 million.
About 3 million at that point, okay? So again, that's often what people get a little wrapped up about, is the idea that it goes through this kind of series of funhouse mirrors.
That election was kind of odd because you usually think of like winning like the popular voters in the election as it's like winning the election but not like a majority of the states. It's like you carry like the big states, but
Right.
Trump kind of like carried like all the
Yeah, rural, he flipped states that, again, he had a pathway. He had a strategy that a lot of the pundits didn't give enough serious thought to. The pollsters didn't necessarily give enough serious thought to. This kind of represented, when this happened, there were a lot of people caught with their pants down, just literally, total surprise. And to be honest with you, myself included. where I just thought from a numeric standpoint, from what the polls and the experts were telling me, no way, right? So this was kind of an eye-opener as to how we track things. And, you know, there's also the factor of like, this is why when you read about the media and the polling kind of process, it's really important. Do I have the right representative sampling? Do I have the right kind of question? Are people going to answer this question truthfully? You know, how often do you drink? Are people going to answer that kind of question honestly? Similarly, if I ask you who you're going to vote for and you're a little uncomfortable with your candidate based on rhetoric, are you necessarily going to be forthcoming about that?
Maine, what's going on with the one?
Proportional, remember?
Nebraska.
Right.
Yep.
That's what caught me.
Does Nebraska have that on theirs too? They don't.
No, Nebraska all went.
Yep.
Gotcha.
Went red. So, again, this is part of the criticism when we look at the numerics. This heightened focus on swing and battleground states, this heightened focus with certain constituencies. Later, we'll look at who those, your political sophistication is going to have to include more than just minority groups go more likely to go Democratic, and white upper income are more likely to go Republican. We're going to drill down on it to the point where we're talking about Catholics and Protestants and Jewish people. We'll talk about gender, we'll talk about age, we'll talk about income. You're going to get to the point where you can kind of understand a demographic and how they'd vote and why, because that's what the, you know, you might be given a map and you might have to explain why it went the way it did. That was like a question in 2000, where literally it was like, why did this region go Republican? Why did this one go Democratic? Okay? So, again, that's kind of some of your backdrop. So understand that there's some issues with the numbers that kind of skew things, but really what it's there to do, there is an intelligence in the design. It's there to kind of get us to a consensus, right? And I'll go over other reasons to not be critical of the Electoral College, but it's there to get us to a consensus. It's there to kind of give some sort of statement about how we should govern, right? Does the political candidate after the elections have a mandate, right? Because they're political scientists and they want jobs, they need barrier language. So in education, it's things like rubrics, and you know, we come up with what was it the other day? Learning modules, or there's all this like technical speak in education, and that's how certain consultants keep their job. Well, political scientists need their jobs too. So they can't just say there's a mandate, they've got to kind of tease it out, right? And then you get to get tested on it. So maintaining election. Let's look at the election results and see what it's saying. Well, this is a maintaining election. The party that was in power remains in power. That one's easy enough, right? How about a deviating election? Well, the minority party captures the White House because of short-term intervening forces. Is the Trumpism, the kind of the Trump revolution, a deviating kind of force? That's still maybe what we're trying to figure out a year in. You had the kind of the traditional Republican Party, and then you had this populist movement where this isn't your typical Republican that is kind of come to the party. Is it because there's been just this surge of populism based on economic factors that have caused people to kind of temporarily come to the Republican Party and push us in a different political direction? Or is it something more permanent? Is that a realigning election where there's a massive shift in partisan identification? Where you really see a realigning election, and we'll highlight it later on, is the former Solid South, right? So which was the party that freed the slaves? The Republican Party, right? So by default, where does the South go? Democrat for the longest time. But eventually what happens is the demographics of kind of the Democratic Party are kind of this interesting mash of, you know, they begin to kind of like, not only is it the, I don't know, Eastern intellectual elites, but also working class, but also you know, minority groups and things like that. The Republicans kind of capitalize on a strategy of using race and using, it's Nixon's strategy of kind of beginning to polarize the Republican South on that issue. And they go from being historically Democratic to all of a sudden flipping. they completely realign and they become Republican. Or have we gone off the rails, and I think maybe we're here, right? There's a de-aligning kind of option.
I was gonna say, like, because like one of Nixon's campaign managers, like years and years later, was talking about how, like, you know, appealing to people who are more racist.
Yep.
Basically saying that you can't go on TV and drop the N-word.
Right.
That wasn't acceptable at the time, but you could go on TV and imply it and still get away and earn that vote.
We'll read a little bit more about the Nixon strategy. There was this kind of, I think, conscious decision to again, and what's interesting is he's also the Nixon of the biracial communities committees to desegregate. I think there was just political calculation that put race as maybe a kind of a collateral, you know, he's got his political goals, his policy goals, and that maybe took a backseat to political goals of winning. Pretty ruthless. So if I can do this in like rapid fire, this gets us to this nice kind of end here. Having looked at the system entirely, right, what's your problem? Well, like I suggested, people feel like it's not direct, that it gives certain states huge advantage, that you can have people go rogue, that you can win the popular vote without winning the election or vice versa, right? That it skews campaigning to where we go. I'm gonna have to spotlight this a lot more because this is its own series of standalone questions about how our system really negates and puts third parties at a disadvantage. So I won't necessarily have, I'll come back and I'll spotlight that a little bit more. And we'll talk about why third parties are really so important. But there are as many pros perhaps as there are cons, and probably the number one pro is for any system that you can suggest to me that's an alternative, it probably has as many negatives as positives, don't you think? It's just you're swapping one set of negatives for a different set of negatives. So that's one argument, is that if I were to go to a popular system, people would like that. It's maybe more democratic. You might strengthen third-party candidates. You might take away the focus from swing states and from certain demographics, and maybe even the kind of the playing field. But man, are there cons that we'll start to look at tomorrow. Okay, lots of kind of cons. And you know, the number one thing is for every pro that you have in that system, you have a con. The thing that I always try to stress is the genius in our system that everyone misses is, do I have to go to all 50 states? Not necessarily, but am I campaigning state by state by state?
Yes.
I've got a pathway. So this gives states a voice, correct? It gives states a check, correct? Right? So that's federalism. If I went to a popular system, would I just be talking to like white Protestants that make up a majority of the population? And I wouldn't necessarily, no longer would you have the states as a check, right? Does this system speed me to a winner?
Yeah.
If I had a popular system, would there be more contested elections that are close, right? And the danger there is what? A closely contested election where I don't like the results. Revolution, burn it down, right?
Yeah, finally,
so yeah, so this kind of maybe speeds us to more satisfying kind of stable election results. Also, if you did a popular system and you had 3 candidates, who wins?
33% of the vote.
Who wins?
At least 33.
Someone who wins with like 33% of the vote. Are you ready to commit to that person as, and what if it's 4 candidates? What if it's 5? So most popular systems have a numeric threshold where you got to capture 40% of the vote in order to actually kind of win the election. What if you don't get 40% the first go around?
Do it again.
Do it again. You want 2 rounds of elections?
No.
Right? You know, picture the cost and things like that. There are other little things I need to drill down on, but we're actually kind of, let me show you guys where we're going to go during our long block. You get to pick an alternative model and kind of look into it. Because I don't have time to cover them all.
I've got some great YouTube videos for that then.
Oh, cool.